Hello, everybody. I'm Robert Casanello, president of UFF UCF, and this is the UFF UCF podcast. And I'm here with Marshall Ogletree, and I heard you're retired, but you seem to be doing a lot of work from what I can tell. So, Marshall, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience? Some of them may know your name, but just for those who don't.
Yeah, Robert, my name is Marshall Ogletree. I'm the retired past executive director of the United Faculty of Florida. And I've had extensive experience in lobbying from my high school teaching experience starting in 1978 through, if you count this session, I did it amateurish, but this session, 2022. So I've lobbied in all or part of those sessions for those years.
And I know, you stepped down and you retired, but you've become involved, continuing to watch the legislature, advising different entities in UFF about what the legislature is doing. So I thought it'd be great for us to have a conversation about the 2022 legislative session and what came out, specifically things that directly impact higher ed and the workplace. So I don't want to get into bill numbers and things like this because I think that would be confusing. So what I'm going to do is just describe different pieces of legislation. If I could get your take on it and what you think someone should know about that piece of legislation. So the first thing I'd like to talk about is the this piece of legislation that requires public colleges and universities to seek a new accreditor every accreditation cycle, and it also includes a post-tenure review. So if we can separate those two things, and I guess the third thing in there is the listing of books for a 5-year period that has been assigned in every course. So there's 3 parts of this specific piece of legislation that we should be aware of. So let's start with the accreditation piece. What do you make of that, and how do you think that's going to impact colleges and universities?
Well, the accreditation piece is a direct response from what one might consider a vindictive legislature over the issue at the University of Florida, where the professors were already testifying on behalf of, voting rights legislation and some other things that have passed that have been very controversial. So that's where it evolved from, because SACS got engaged in that particular process. And I think most universities and colleges use the Southern accreditations. I don't know the exact words that stands for, but they've been around for a long, long time. And I think, they also got involved when Richard Corcoran was going to be a candidate for the job at Florida State University. So it resulted from the political scenario in reality. And it basically says that the Board of Governors, and at the colleges, it would be the State Board of Education, but they will select accrediting associations that can be used, and a university or a college cannot use the same accrediting agency twice in a row, pure and simple. And I think it's a direct slap at SACS.
I mean, what's the danger to that, do you think? I mean, what's it going to do?
Well, the danger is, I think they may even ultimately establish their own accrediting association for Florida only. I think that's the potential danger of this. There are only certain accreditation associations that exist. And, obviously the most renowned in America, as far as I know, is SACS. Certainly, if not the most renowned, certainly in the top 2 or 3. And to say that they're a problem, I think, is a false message.
And I guess a smaller thing in this piece of legislation, maybe still bad but smaller, is the the listing of books and course materials for a 5-year window for every course. But where'd that come from?
Again, I think it comes from a lot of concern about I guess you might say, the perceived progressive nature of university faculty, and the fact that it's done under the umbrella of what had happened a couple years ago in affordability of textbooks, and they added transparency to that title. That section of law now includes transparency. I think they're trying to shed a light on practices that probably are purely professional and in doing the best for students, but trying to shed a light on some of the maybe liberal thinking that's going on out there. The idea of liberals is perceived by many politicians as a negative term. Obviously, it should not be perceived that way, but nevertheless, that's unfortunately, in my opinion, the political nature of what's going on in Florida right now, from public education through many other issues, of course, including higher education.
So you would anticipate there will be a lot of people doing keyword searches for critical and race in a lot of these materials. And
yeah. When you tie these bills together, obviously they were separate pieces of legislation, but when you tie HB 7 into this mix, what are they actually looking for? Even at the K-12 level, I feel sorry for teachers in the social studies curriculum areas, because how do you teach certain areas, slavery, Civil War, Jim Crow Act, go on and on and on, without somebody feeling guilty, maybe. There's no intent. I mean, obviously, I've been around for a long time and I don't feel any guilt about the teachings I've had, but, I've had professors that have taught these things in a manner of reality, the truth. And, parents might feel bad about something, but their kids, I don't think, will have the same feeling. They have a different experience in life. But it's kind of a microscope we're living under. What's being taught, teachers and professors are going to be under the microscope, in my opinion, because of this legislation, the Stop Woke Act, and now the implications of that act upon professors and accreditation and many other things. I think there's a direct link to all these things together. They're not single, one issue. They're combined into an attack on, I think, the public consciousness of the last 30 years as we tried to evolve into a society of everyone is treated fairly and equally, no matter what their race is, our sex is. I think we're seeing sliding backwards. We're not Leave It to Beaver anymore, but it appears we are headed in that direction.
Sure. So
I get too young to understand Leave It to Beaver.
No, I remember Leave It to Beaver. It was in syndication when I was a young person. So this kind of leads me, because you brought up HB 7, which is the anti-woke legislation that the governor was promoting. And the last part of this piece of legislation that should concern us, I think, is the post-tenure review. So what's in this post-tenure review that, we should be conscious of?
Well, I guess the only positive is it says the Board of Governors may adopt a post-tenure review. There are some universities that already have post-tenure review, but that's negotiated. And I think no matter what is adopted by the Board of Governors, it would have to be, negotiated at the university level. But the whole idea is this distrust of the system and the perceptions that academia is too powerful of in my opinion, again, too powerful of a political entity. Uh, I don't view it that way at all. Academia is the nurturing of our youth, the training of our youth, whether it be professional, sociological, or whatever. But the legislature looks at this as the enemy. Uh, that's, and I'm not saying the entire legislature, I'm talking about, unfortunately, the leadership and the governor. They see academia as the enemy, in essence, because it's changing our society, in their opinion, in a wrong direction. I think that's evident by the actions of the governor with COVID-19 and other things. And this legislation is just a follow-up on that attitude.
Sure. So to move on here, the one piece of legislation I know was passed really early was the public records and public meetings that would make presidential searches at colleges and universities in the dark until the last interview, the on-campus interview, I think. I know there have been faculty representatives on our campus who have been applauding this piece of legislation. There's others who have been concerned and voiced grave suspicions about it. What do you think someone should walk away with from this piece of legislation? What should they know about?
All I can say is the United Faculty of Florida Senate has opposed this legislation for 8 years, and I might say unanimously, as does the First Amendment Foundation in Florida. The closing this type of examination from the public and the concerned public, which include faculty and students and the community at large. Universities are entities that have billion-dollar budgets, and the leadership of those institutions are important to that community, to that university, and to the state of Florida. The reality of the situation is whether it will do damage or not will depend upon how it's finally implemented. We're going to know fairly soon because we have 5 universities, I think, that are under that umbrella right now. But article in the newspaper here in Tallahassee just today, I think, was kind of saying, will Richard Corcoran, who's resigned as Commissioner of Education, become a candidate at one of these 5 universities? They wanted him to be a candidate at Florida State University, but it was public information then, and the public went nuts here in Tallahassee about that issue. So I'm very concerned about it as an individual, but from the union perspective and from the faculty perspective, I think it's just the wrong thing because, and by the way, I've read countless places that it talks about 3 applicants. That is not in the statute that passed. I'm hoping that the universities will allow 3 at least, but that's not in there. And the timeline of the 21 days is before the candidates or final candidates are announced or the first interview. And, I just have a problem with that personally. I just think it's wrong. But at the same time, in the end, if the university gets a great candidate and the faculty and everyone likes that candidate, fine. But what's happened in some other states has been some people that had criminal records or were left without any information being told about their past background at the previous university.
Or how they handled sexual discrimination cases.
Yeah, sexual
that went
discrimination
before them and things like this, right?
in large part was the problem. And they've gotten jobs and then the university's been embarrassed because they find out about it after the fact. So, will that happen in Florida? No one knows. But most of these laws that close the sunshine out are not good things. I mean, the public has a right to know, and Florida led the nation in that, and we're closing more and more windows of public scrutiny year after year.
Certainly, certainly. So you've already mentioned HB7, and this is the anti-woke that would sort of ban the discussion of various topics, some of which are described in the legislation. Others said that the directives would come from the Florida Department of Education on what these topics are and what is prohibited from discussion in a classroom. And this is, I think, the most confusing for our folks on the ground, because parts of this piece of legislation are written specifically for K through 12, yet there's language that's K through 20, which includes university and public universities and colleges. And to compound that, there's parts of this legislation that speak to professional development workshops and things like this that would involve human resources or other offices, support offices. But then there's language of instruction, like if instruction is given, is the phrase that I read in this piece of legislation. So how far do you think this piece of legislation goes? Will it move beyond workshops and professional development into the actual classrooms of public colleges and universities? I'm sure that's the intent, right? And the question is whether the Board of Governors are going to sort of weaponize this, right?
Well, I think it probably will. You know, I noticed in the legislation, even joint labor management committees could be penalized for having some kind of training that might be prohibited in this particular legislation, because you might be making someone feel guilty about past actions of their race or whatever. But if you look at a few of the things that are the Equity Act and so forth, there are two different things here, but they have the same, the Florida Civil Rights Act and the Florida Educational Equity Act all contain the same descriptors of what can't be done. And I'm just going to read a couple of you, which might help understand a little bit about this. A person by virtue of his or her race, color, national origin, or sex bears responsibility for or should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment because of actions committed in the past by other members of the same race, color, national origin, or sex. And it goes on, you know, talks about feeling guilt about this. And, you know, I don't think any professor or teacher in K-12 is going to be implying there's guilt. But the fact is that this has happened. It happens repeatedly. Unfortunately, Black Lives Matter came about because of all the actions that have occurred against Black citizens, primarily by police officers. And my son's a police officer, so I'm sympathetic to his cause as a policeman, but, you know, no one should be discriminated against because of their colors, sex, or national origin. So this is where I guess the rubber meets the road, you know, in the classroom. It's in the training too. The basis is the same for the training as it is in the classroom. You know, you supposedly have to tailor your instruction, and maybe you have to give a warning, you know, to your class. I'm not intending to say that you're guilty of this or whatever. I don't know what the final analysis will be on this, but it's very loose. But anytime you can be sued for something, and you know, it probably will be worse in K-12, I would imagine, because then the parent is the person that might sue. I think there have already been cases, not necessarily because this law hadn't passed yet, but there have been complaints against teachers in K-12 for bringing up these subjects throughout the country. And I know particularly one individual in Florida who was a member of our union in Pinellas County that's been allegedly done this. So this is real. It may depend upon ultimately the case being decided in court, and you know, maybe they will see the evil of their ways, but I don't think this is a good thing. And again, I think it may be worse in K-12 just because of the nature of the age of the students. But I don't think, certainly trainings and certainly instruction, when you're in a social, sciences type discipline, there's always that risk, I believe.
And of course, the troubling epilogue to all this is the fact that a conforming bill was passed onto the budget that would police HB 7 by means of a court, the Board of Governors, or any standing committee in the Florida legislature, which is really disturbing, which means any committee chair could bring some sort of a pronouncement about a violation of HB 7 to any college or public college or university. And then the threat there is that the performance funding for the following year would be cut as a result of this. So
if substantiated, yeah, the performance funding for that university would be cut off the following year. And, the reality of the situation is that the governor has wide powers, and the powers of appointment are critical. As you know, Robert, the boards of trustees have all been appointed by Republican governors, pretty much Scott and DeSantis at this point. Maybe a few are left from the other governors, but Republican governors have been here since 1998. So, that's a dilemma, but they don't only just appoint board of trustees, they appoint judges. And I can't tell you that our system of judges now, unfortunately, I think has become overly politicized as well. So what a case would do that would go to court, who knows what the final answer would be. But all in all, when you put all these pieces of legislation together, I see them as an attack on academia, academic freedom, and as you said before, with what happened in the one bill, tenure. So you put them all together, and they're attacking the very foundations of higher education, in my opinion. And I think it's from a political attack as opposed to any realistic problem that exists in our university system. I mean, for what we pay, this university system is one of the best in America. And the amount of money they put into it has always been underfunded, but yet you and others overproduce and create a great education system.
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely felt on the ground. So my last question here for you, Marshall, in your experience, and I'm assuming we're going back to 1978, where does this legislature fit as far as, I don't want to say the best to the worst, but maybe really bad to the worst? Where is this 2022 legislature fit in your opinion?
Well, in my view, and the view of many other people where I've read in the newspaper that have pretty common opinions to what I have, it's the worst. And it's become progressively worse in the last 4 or 5 years. I wrote an op-ed piece about how bad it was when Corcoran introduced language at the last minute in a conforming bill like we had this year in the conforming bill in education about performance funding. That all the normal rules and regs that occurred in the legislature have been bastardized in the past few years. I mean, there's not open testimony on a lot of things these days. And even when there is, Robert, you may be aware, I don't know if you came to Tallahassee, but many of our members came to Tallahassee, and you might get 30 seconds to speak on something or a minute to speak on something, and there are no speakers for the bill, but the bill passes anyway because it's a Republican-sponsored bill. Bipartisanship needs to become more of a reality. And that's the weakness from 1978 to now, there was bipartisanship. There was compromise. That seemed to be lost in the middle 2000s, certainly from Governor Scott forward. We've lost bipartisanship, cordiality, respect for others in the legislative process. And that's a shame.
Okay, so we'll end it there. Marshall, thank you so much for joining us.
Enjoyed it. Best of luck to UCF and you, Robert. I know you've done a great job with the union there, and keep it going.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I appreciate it.